Welcome back, sewists. Fit check. If you want to make this dress, I'll have it linked below. I have a full tutorial on it, and it is definitely one of my favorites. Look at the cute details on it. Anyway, welcome back for part 2 for sewing this adorable tropical shirt, though I made it in a color blocked design. And last week we did the cutting out, laying, and prep. So if you want to see that, that will also be linked below, and we're going to get right into sewing. All right, now we're ready to go get our pocket ready, and then we're going to transfer our markings so we know where to align our pocket on the front of our shirt, and we'll stitch our pocket down. So easy. And it's already going to start looking like a shirt. All right, so I have turned under all of my edges, and I am now just going to top stitch down the hem of the pocket. So the pattern has these markings on it for the different sizes. So I'm going to use the size I need, and I'm going to put a little, put my pin through it, open it up, and mark it. And then I'm also going to mark my front sleeve so I can do match up my sleeves later. And if there's anything else that needs marked, I will transfer those markings. But I think really that's just the sleeve and the pocket are all I need. First of all, this is giving me such 80s wallpaper vibe. I remember having a wallpaper that looked like this back in the 80s. Anyway, here's my little marking. Can you see that little tiny mark? So that's where my corner is going to go. Because I have nice straight lines, it makes it very easy for me to line up so that my pocket's not on there crooked. And that's it, it's pinned down. So now we're going to stitch around this outer edge. And usually on pockets, I do a little triangle where I stitch up, go across, and back down, and that just makes the pocket a little more sturdy, especially if the pocket's going to get used. It keeps it from getting ripped and pulled off. The other thing you can do is put a little piece of interfacing in these corners here before you sew it on, and that makes the fabric behind it a little stronger. And I often will do that with a patch pocket like this, especially if I think the person's going to be using the pocket. So you could actually just lay a piece of fabric or fuse on a little piece of interfacing right in these corners. You can feel it right there on the back side of the garment before you sew it on. A pocket. And I just love the way that looks. That's so cute. So we now have our little pocket on. So here are my fronts. We'll set them aside. And we're going to now go to step 3, which is making the collar. And the first thing they have us do is sew together our center back seam of the under collar. So we're just going to sew that center back seam, and then we're going to press it open. Now remember, this under collar is bias. So was my pocket by choice. And because of that, there's a lot more stretch and give in the it's less stable. So you have to be careful when sewing these that you don't stretch them out. 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Don't forget to back stitch. Just 1 or 2 stitches is all it takes as a rule. Okay, so we now have an under collar like this. The little lines line up perfectly. They look really nice. So I'm going to just press open this seam allowance. Once that's pressed open, we're going to lay our upper collar on our lower collar, and we're going to sew around 3 sides. We're going to leave the bottom where it attaches to the shirt open. We're going to sew the sides and the top. There's a very slight flare on this collar, and I would recommend, because one side is interfaced and one side is not, the piece that is interfaced I would put up, and the piece that is not interfaced I would put down towards the feed dogs, and that lets the machine handle any movement that might happen between the fabric that's super stable because of the interfacing and the fabric that is not that stable because it's biased and is not interfaced. Put a few pins in this. The under collar should be just a tiny bit smaller. So when I'm pinning this, I'm pulling it all the way to the outer edge. But can you see, I don't know if you can see, but it's just pulling just slightly, and that is how it should be. That is what makes the under collar do its job. It needs to be a wee bit smaller to make everything tuck under. So here we are. Want to make sure that that seam stays flat, that we don't fold over our seam lines. And the next thing they show is, I'm going to do it on this side so you can see, because the interfacing makes it easier to see. We have these little corners, and we're going to trim out that corner up to, but not through, the stitching. Something I don't mean to. So we're going to cut off those corners. That makes it lay nicer. And once we've trimmed those corners, they have us come in and do a couple little clips along this outer edge. It's very slightly curved, and it's just going to make it lay nicer when we press it. You can also trim out the undercollar seam allowance a little bit narrower if it's looking a little bulky. All those little areas will open up, and now we can flip this around. Now we're going to, I put my finger in that corner, and if you need to, I can already tell this is going to be a little bit thick. I cut that corner like at a 45-degree angle, but I'm going to actually trim it out even more because I can just tell it's going to be a little bit bulky. All right, so here we are. Before I press it, on grain collar, bias grain collar, or straight of grain and bias grain. Now we're ready to press this, and you can top stitch it, and I would recommend top stitching it. It's just going to make everything lay flat and nice, and you won't have any fold over. So let's give this a quick press. When pressing this, and now it's going to be hard to see on mine, but it won't be, it depends on the fabric you've chosen. You want to press this so that the under collar is pulled slightly to the back. So when you're pressing, you're going to see a little bit of the front collar or the upper collar on the back side. I'm talking a 1/16 of an inch. You just don't want the under collar to peek through at all. And the under collar is a tiny bit smaller, so it should be pretty easy for you to press it in such a way that all of the under collar is on the back side and will not peek back through. And then we will just top stitch around. All right, can you see? This is where it's stitched together, and this is the top collar or the upper collar rolling to the back just slightly. And that way, when it's flipped over, this is the right side, none of the under collar is peeking through at all, and that's what we want. All right, I'm just going to top stitch around. They say 1/4 of an inch. And there are markings on the pattern for the pleat. We need to transfer that to our shirt. And we're going to just match the two little notches or the two little markings on top of each other. So we're going to lay them right on top of each other. So I'm going to show you the right side. This is the right side of the garment. Here are my pleats. They pleat out towards the shoulder. And we're just going to, I'm going to just tack that down real quick with a little stitch up at the top. Okay. And it's happy. So we have pleats. That's step 4. We're now ready to do our yoke. I love yokes. And we're going to sew these to our back. There are markings so you can get everything lined up. So we want to have the one that is cut on the bias. For me, that's what I chose to do, a one on the bias. It's going to be on the right side. So I'm going to just put a couple pins to hold it in place. And I'm doing right side to right side. So then we're going to take the other one, which is our yoke lining or the wrong side, and we're going to sandwich it on the other side. So here we are. So one is on the bias and one is not. Now because this has a yoke, everything's nice and enclosed. You don't have to worry about seam finishes. Just a little close-up of how the back yoke looks. This is the wrong side, right side to right side, and it's sandwiched. So here is the other side of the yoke. And this one is right side to wrong side. So this is the right side of my shirt, because that's the side that I put the bias yoke on. And now we're ready to sew this at 3/8 of an inch. So check your seam whenever you're done. You want to check and make sure you don't have any buckles or bubbles. This is the right side. This is the wrong side. You could always choose to line your yoke in a totally different fabric. Like I could have used a gingham check in here or something else if you want to make it a little lighter. To just use the interior parts. You can line collars, cuffs, yokes, facings. Those can all be in a contrast fabric and a lighter weight fabric like a gingham check or batiste or something like that. Anyway, isn't that cute? So now that we've done that, making sure we're paying attention to which is our right side. So for me, that is the bias cut side. I'm going to grab my fronts, and that includes the front that we put our little pocket on, and we're going to match those up at the shoulder. So if you were following along with the directions, we are now to step 5. So we're going to come up here shoulder to shoulder, and I'm going to just pin this shoulder. I'm going to pin each shoulder on first, just to the front yoke, which for me is the bias yoke, right sides together. So we are pinned together just on the right side of the yoke. And here's the wrong side. But what we need to do is we need to get all of this sandwiched in so that we can pull the yoke around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay all of this down on top of itself. I'm going to fold them in half first, make it a little more manageable, and roll these up as tight as I can. And the lighter weight your fabric, the easier it's going to be. And we've also got to do it for the back. Okay, so there's those, and then the back. And it shows this in the directions. They do a pretty good job of showing how this looks. All right, so now I can pull all this around and pin it and sew these shoulders, which is what they're showing here. All right, so there it is, all rolled up on the inside. You can roll it as tight as you can, because it makes it a little easier to work with, so you don't accidentally stitch through something you don't mean to. Okay, so here's my sausage. Isn't that lovely? Mine's pretty tight. This is a pretty heavy fabric, so I'm going to make sure and push it down the best I can and stitch this. So be careful not to stretch it. There's one. I'm checking to make sure that my inner one didn't slide down. Everything's accurate, and we're going to go ahead and do the next one. So here's our little sausage. I'm going to pull through the neck. We're going to do this carefully. My fabric frays, so I don't want to cause any stretchage or fraying. I went and double checked all my little shoulder seams, making sure that everything was caught, that nothing had slipped down. I'm going to pull my little sausage rolls through. And we have a shirt with a completely self-enclosed yoke. So here's our front, here's our back. So now it's ready to be pressed, and I'm going to look and see if they recommend top stitching. And they do. They recommend top stitching. So I am going to press it. Okay, I'm going to give it a quick press and we'll top stitch. Okay, this is so cute. I'm going to wish I made it for myself. And then they have us also go ahead and do a little basting around the neckline. That's to keep the neckline from stretching out. So we're going to go ahead and do a little basting around this inner neckline too, just to keep everything copacetic. We don't want any issues. All right, so I'm just going to go around the neckline first and get that sort of secured. So that is our stay stitching, just to keep the neckline in place. Now I'm going to come in and we're just going to do the 1/4 inch stitching right along these edges. Yeah, that looks really nice. That looks really nice. Here is how it looks when you do a little top stitching, and it does add quite a bit. And I'm glad I changed threads. It just looks a little bit more elevated when it matches. That looks so nice to have a little bit of top stitching. We are ready to do our front facings. Okay, we're going to take our 2 facings. We've got a white one and a black one, right sides together. So I'm just going to straight stitch down on the front edge only, all the way down for both facings. That's pretty easy and straightforward. Okay, all right, so now we have 2 facings. That was step 7. or I'm sorry, step 8. Step 9, we're ready to work on collar. Woo, woo. Okay, so the under collar, I love how this is done. We're going to take our under collar, which is the bias one, and we're going to line that up with our neckline. So we're going to find our center back of our neck, which is on the yoke, and I just fold it in half and find that little mark. And we're going to then put our seam from our collar, under collar, on that spot. And then there are markings on your shirt so you don't make your collar go too far forward. You don't want it to go, it should end before your face. The way the collar works is when it folds back, part of that facing makes the little bottom notch of the collar. So we want to make sure that we don't go too far or we'll have issues. And because we have bias in this neckline, in this collar, it shapes lovely. Bias is so nice for shaping. Put a few pins in it. Now we are not sewing end to end. We're kind of sewing in the middle between those two markings because this is going to get caught in that facing here in a minute. Lovely, lovely. This pattern goes together beautifully. Everything fits great. If you trace it off properly, you will have no issues. Very pleased with how it's going together, and it's a very nicely sewn collar, and they have excellent directions. I have only nice things to say about it so far. So here we are pinned on. This is the inside of our yoke. Here's the outside, and we've only pinned the under collar. So the upper collar is free, and there are two little markings, and they are about with your, they're pretty close to your edges of your yoke. And that is what we are going to be sewing our collar on. So we're sewing at 3/8 of an inch. Make sure to catch all of your layers. I have got the collar up and the yoke down. So our collar is on, just in the back between those markings. Now it wants us to take, we're going to just let the whole collar fold on top of itself. And we're going to let the facing fold over that, and we're just going to pin down the facing. So the facing is sandwiching the collar. Now they have folded under this raw edge and pinned it and stitched it down, which you certainly can do. I serged my edge so it's not as important because I have seam finished it, though it just looks nicer if that is folded and stitched down. I think I will. I'm just going to stitch it down. That little edge of the facing, just give it a little top stitch just because it looks so much neater. We're going to take our whole garment here. We're going to let this fold back as it wants to. And then we're going to sandwich that collar inside. Put a few pins in it. And your facing should come just about to the edge of that yoke. Like they should be pretty close to each other. Make sure all of your edges meet up. So our facing is now sandwiching that collar. All right, so I have quite a few pins. Here's our collar, here's our yoke down here, and the facing. So we're stitching this little section on each side. We're just going to stitch this curvy spot. Okay, so here is my facing, my collar, my shirt. You can see how they're pinned together. This is where we've already sewn the front facing. On the inside, you can see there's the collar caught. So we are going to stitch just this part. Once that's done, we'll do the clipping and flipping to the inside of our collar. 3/8 of an inch. You want to make sure you have all of your layers caught and together. There's my 3/8 inch mark on my machine, if you're wondering what I'm looking at. Now I'm going to actually sink and turn right here and make this nice and strong in that corner. Do my back stitch way down there. All right, so there's one done. Clipping it out, and I see, oh, I see on the back I flipped it over, and can you see this little mark right here? So I'm going to pull out these couple stitches and fix this area right here where it pulled, and then I can also see, look down here, see how it pulled down? That's why we inspect everything before we move on, because that is not acceptable. So I'm actually going to rip out and redo. So we have a collar on, and we have a facing on. We're going to come in really quickly. I'm going to double check everything, make sure nothing slipped, because that would be disastrous, because we're getting ready to do some trimming. I don't know why, but my camera has a maximum recording time, and I need to figure out how to turn that off, because if I were ever to do like a live stream class or something like that, it would just shut off in the middle of it and would be very annoying. Okay, so here's our ivory side. I'm going to trim out my corner like we did before, so we have a nice sharp corner. Up to but not through your stitches. And then we're going to, in this curvy part, we're going to clip again up to but not through our stitches all along our collar and neckline in this little curvy area of the facing. There's a couple places where it's pretty thick because we have got multiple layers of collar and interfacing and shirt, so just be real careful. But what that does is that lets that open up so that it will lay nice. And then this whole thing gets flipped around like so. And then we can tack down our facing. All right, so these are our directions. We've sewn this little back part on. We've come up and we've sewn our facing. It looks like this. So here's our collar sandwiched in. Here's where the back facing is on. So you can see the collar's open between the facings on the upper collar, but the bottom collar or the under collar is stitched. And we are now trimming off the collar, trimming off the corner and doing some little clips to each side. So we can get a nice turn. You want to make sure you've checked everything before you do this, because if you have to fix anything once you've cut, it makes it a lot harder. This is pretty thick through here, so I'm being real careful. You want to go up to but not through. Sometimes you want to cut through more than one layer, or cut one layer at a time, I should say, because there's a collar and a facing, but we want to be able to get that to open up nicely. So once we've done all of that, the thing that is a little hard to understand from the directions is right in here on the collar, right where the facing, I'm going to show on this side because it's easier to see, right where the facing ends, we're going to cut the collar just a tiny bit so we can flip this part of the collar to the inside and enclose all of this. Okay, so here's our upper collar, here's the under collar, and right here where the facing is, I'm going to come back just a tiny bit and I'm going to clip. Now I'm just clipped up to the facing, but what happens is that allows, I'm going to do it on both sides, that allows me to tuck all of this up into the collar, and then this will flip around and I will be able to whip stitch this down by hand. You could also machine stitch it, but I'm going to hand stitch it. So I'm going to whip stitch this down by hand. This gets flipped around like this, and now the collar's completely enclosed, and you don't have to worry about fraying. I am going to come back on this. I'm going to serge this part of the, see how much it frays? I'm going to serge this just because I don't want to have any issues with this in the wash. So this is going to get serged, this little top portion up here, just for safety's sake on both sides of this, but we're going to clip the upper collar inside this facing area. I'm pulling the facing down. I know it's hard to see because it's all black. And I'm going to clip right here, close to that stitching. See how much that's fraying. Look at all the frays. So that's why I'm going to serge that. All of this is going to get tucked inside the collar though when I whip stitch it down, and that's going to be sealed off. done that, I've just flipped everything around. I haven't pressed it yet, but you can see now it's faced. So there's the facings on each side, and then I have tucked up all of that raw edge is now inside the collar, and I've pinned it down so that I can just hand whip it. I can also whip down the facing if I want to. The facing is a little short. I'm not sure why. I expected it to meet the yoke, and it does not. Don't know why. If that's a mistake on my end, or if it wasn't intended, though it sure looks like it when looking at the directions. Yeah, when you look at the directions, they show whip stitching it down, but it does not. It's a 1/2 inch shy, so that may be a mistake I made. I'll be curious if you also find that the facing is a little bit short. Right there, it's fine, like everything's enclosed, but I can't whip it to the facing because there's space there. It just won't reach. I'm going to come down to the hem, and if you look at step 12, they say measure up 3/4 of an inch, and we're going to sew the facing right here. What that does is it starts our hem for us. So we're going to sew that 3/4 of an inch, and then when we flip this around, the hem is begun on that side, and then we can roll under the rest of the hem, but it'll already be started. So I'm going to go ahead and sew that right now before pressing anything. And that's just in the face. Once we get to the facing, we're done. We just sew it the length of the facing. So we're going to trim out this corner. Now they trim all the way up. I'm not going to trim all the way up. I'm just going to trim part of it for now. I can always trim more later if I feel like I need to. Get rid of those corners. All right, so I have the collars completely done. I've just whip stitched it down from the inside. Here it is from the outside. You can see it's completely enclosed, nice and neat. Here's the facing. So that's done. And then we've already done our little thing at the bottom hem, this right here. Now we're going to come back. I'm going to press this up 3/4 of an inch all the way across, and then I'm going to tuck it back under so that we have a nice narrow hem like this, and I'm going to just top stitch it down. I'm going to do that for both fronts and the back, because that is the preparation we do to do our side seam. So let's get our hems in next. All right, so here is my hem. You can see how I've just tucked it in. It's ready to go. So I'm showing you on the light side because it's easiest to see. I will top stitch on this side though. So I'm going to lay it down on this side and stitch it. I will change thread and stitch this side in ivory. I'm going to go ahead, since I have black on there, and stitch my back and my black front, the ones that are black. I'm going to go ahead and stitch those really quickly, and then change my thread. So that is step 12. We're completing step 12. So we're going to get hems in, and then we'll come back and talk side seam. Quick close-up of how the hem looks. Right side and wrong side. Looks the same on the black, but it's harder to see. Looks great. I'm going to hold this up so you can kind of get a view of how it's looking. Isn't that cute? So here's our collar. You can see how the facing folds back to make the bottom part of the collar. I really like it. I have got my hems in. So we're going to now work on side seam. Now it doesn't say a lot about side seam, about seam finishing it. The side seam has a little notch out for making a little vent on the side, and what I'm going to do is just serge the edge all the way down to seam finish this, because look at how it frays. So I'm going to serge just that outer edge independently. I'm going to sew it so we can press it open to make the vent. If you do not have an overlock, you can zigzag down that edge. You can bias bind it. This has got pretty narrow seam allowance, so it would be hard to do a self-enclosed seam on this one because it's so narrow. I'm only doing the side seam. I'm not doing up into the arm's eye where the sleeve is going to go. All right, now we're ready to do a side seam. So the side seam is just going to be matching right sides together. We're going to sew from the underarm down to where the vent begins. Now that that's done, we can press open this seam. So this is our side seam on the inside. We're going to press it open. I'm showing you on this one because it's just easier to see than on all black. So we pressed it open, and when we get down here to where the vent is, we are going to, so it's pressed, that whole seam allowance is pressed back. Then we're going to tuck this back under to finish it, and we're going to top stitch this up to the point, and then we're going to do the same thing on this side. Top stitch up and come to a little point. I'm going to do a point at least on mine. You could come straight in, but I'm going to do a little point on each side. And for this one, I will change my thread just for this little section. I'm going to sew all the black first, come back, switch the thread, and then we'll be ready for sleeve. We're all hemmed. It looks cute. We're ready to do sleeves. So we're going to just fold right sides together and sew our underarm seam. I'm going to serge mine together for both sleeves, and then we're going to hem the sleeve before we put it in. I'm going to go ahead and leave my ivory thread on and do my ivory sleeve first for hemming, and then switch to the black and do the black sleeve for hemming, and then we'll be ready to insert them both with black thread. Body and top stitch the armhole. Yep, they top stitch the armhole. Okay, let's just do our underarm sleeve seam real quick, and make sure you've marked your front and your back. It's important to be able to tell the difference because they fit in differently. It matters. Now for hemming, if you don't want to do the folded up twice hem so it's all self-enclosed, you could serge the hem, press it up, and just stitch it one time. It would have to be a deeper hem than they're doing, but you could do that if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and do the fold twice. So I think they fold up. Press up the hem 3/8 of an inch, and then press it up 1 1/4 inches. So that's the whole hem. So we're going to press your little seam down too. Get that pressed down. We're going to come all the way around, press up 3/8 of an inch. Once that's pressed up, we're going to press again 1 1/4 inches, flip it over, and top stitch. So we're going to do that for both sleeves, get them hemmed, and then I'll meet you back here for putting them in. And they don't even really have, sometimes they'll have you do an ease stitch in this cap. They don't even have you do that for this. So very easy. All right, so this is the wrong side, and I've slid my shirt in. So we have right side shirt to right side of sleeve. Match up at the underarm, match up our notches, and we're just pinning it in. It fits lovely. Sew it in at 3/8 of an inch. Once I sewed it in at 3/8, I came back. Here's the other sleeve, and then I serged around just to get it nice and finished. So that sleeve's in. I'm going to go ahead and sew this one in. Then they recommend pressing your seam allowance and top stitching it, and I'm pretty sure they press it towards the shirt. Oh, this is cute. I am loving how this looks. Wait till I put it on the dress form. You guys will too. Okay, so I'm going to just press this out and top stitch around my armhole. You can see I've taken off my tray and I'm sewing with the free arm because it just makes it a little easier to do sleeves and things. All right, I double checked, and it is. You're going to press the seam allowance into the shirt, and then you're going to top stitch around the sleeve. That holds the seam allowance in. It also just makes it look nice and finished. This sleeve, I've already got black thread, so I'm going to go ahead and go around this sleeve with the black thread. And then when I do this one, when I press it over, because I have two colors, I'm going to sew the back on with the black thread, and then I'm going to switch my thread one more time and top stitch this side with the ivory thread just to keep the continuity. Then I'll put the black thread back on for buttonholes. I think my buttonholes are on the black side, so going back to the black for the buttonholes. I'm thinking I put the pocket on the wrong side. I think I was, if I look at the picture, I think the pocket's supposed to be on the other side, but I don't really care. I think it's cute. It doesn't really matter. And then after this garment, it will be time for a fresh needle and oiling my machine. There are buttonhole markings on the pattern, and you just choose the button. They're kind of overlapping, and you choose the one for the size that you're doing. Or the old-fashioned saying was men's shirts button left over right and women's shirts button right over left. So left over right's a men's shirt, right over left is women's. I think that that is still being used some in industry, but I also think it's changing. Left over right can be worn by anyone, can be almost unisex at this point. It's just clothes, right? So many people are choosing, it's a button-down shirt. It looks the same for a man or a woman. The only difference is the direction of buttons. Anyone can wear it. It doesn't matter as much as it used to. That's where I'm going with this. I am going to do buttonholes on the left side, buttons on the right. So my buttonholes are going to be on the left, or on the black, so I need to switch back to black thread. But first I need to mark my buttonholes. I can use their markings if I want to. The main thing is I want to start my first buttonhole below where the little collar folds back. So my first button and buttonhole should start below this little collar fold back. And then the last buttonhole, it kind of depends on how you like it. Theirs is pretty high where their last one is. So usually 2 to 3 inches above the hem is where the last buttonhole should be. These buttonholes, for me personally, I'm going to do them vertically. The easy way is to mark the top and the bottom. If you're doing an uneven number, mark where you want your first one and your last one, and then find the middle of that. That'll be your middle one, and then find the middle between those two. That's the easy way if you don't have a marking. So for me, I'm going to do one. Here's my top, and here's my bottom. Okay, so here's my top and my bottom. And then between those, exactly in between those, will be my middle button. Okay, so now I have 3 buttons. Now, because I'm doing 5, I need one between these 2 markings. So I line those up. I'm not even doing any math. Put a pin there. So can you see the little pin sticking up? So I have 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to do between these 2. Line the pins on top of each other. Find the middle part. Mark the middle. Alright, so now that is where my buttonholes would be. Can you see the little pins up here? Those are where my buttonholes will be. And I'm going to line them up and down on this line because it's exactly where my buttonhole needs to be. So I'm going to put a few markings with my pencil where I want them to start and stop. My sewing machine memorizes the first buttonhole. So once I get to the first buttonhole the way I like it, it will make all the others exactly the same. It'll start and stop on its own. Mark where we want to start and stop. Now where I have put this is sort of the center of the buttonhole. So I'm actually going to mark above that a little bit to where I want to start the buttonhole. Your buttonhole should be however long your button is plus the depth. So if you have a very thin button, you don't need as long a buttonhole. So if you have a really thick button, you're going to need a bigger buttonhole. So I'm going to mark where each of these is going to start. I have a little yellow line. Let's get our buttonholer out. Put my black thread back on. This is the last thing other than sewing on the button. I think I have a video on sewing on buttons. I have a whole series called the Notebook series, and they're really short little videos. When I taught sewing, one of the very first things we did was we made ourselves a notebook, and it was a lot of basic things that you need to know that you could go back and refer to, like how to do a French seam, how to do a buttonhole, how to do a zipper. And we did samples in our little notebook, and then they kind of made their own little manuals to go back and look at, and they were their own samples. It was really fun. I always enjoyed it. The kids always enjoyed it. We took pictures of their projects and put in there also as a way to kind of document their sewing journey. I marked the tops and I should have marked the bottoms. Isn't that always the way? One buttonhole in. Lovely. All right, I'm going to finish this and I'm going to sew my buttons on. I'll meet you over at the dress form and I'll show you how it looks. I'm also going to give it a quick press. Well, that's stinking loud. This is the look I had in my head. I'm happy with it. I think it looks super cute. I'm very pleased with the pattern. This is a PDF pattern. If you've never sewn with this particular company before, I will say that they have good instructions. The pattern went together perfectly. Everything fits great. The only place I had an issue was on the inside facing. It didn't quite meet at the yoke, and I think that was a me mistake, not a pattern mistake, because everything else went together so well. I'm really pleased with these buttons too. There's some vintage ones that I had in my stash and I really like them. See you next week for another fun video.